sure I've asked this before, but do we have many fishermen here? Anyone who likes to, or often goes fishing, or? Now we learn. He's a pro.
Roy goes but by himself.
I was remembering that, for many, fishing is not just a hobby, but a way of life for a lot of people in this country. And I saw a little story about fishing this week, so I had to click on it. I was online when I saw it because, of course, fishing has been on my brain here this week. And it was about the Gulf of Maine. And there are generations of fishermen there where this is their livelihood. And as it turns out, they just decided to pass a rule or law that they have to slash cod catch rates by 77%. And 55% in other areas. Because not that cod are anywhere near being an endangered species yet, but there should be more of them. And between pollution and overfishing, there are just not as many cod as there should be, and so they're trying to protect that habitat. But it was just, listening to the comments of those who are fishermen, this would decimate a lot of fishing communities. And, there was, some have even already put their boats up for sale. And one person said it just doesn't make sense anymore to depend on this. So I guess we're fortunate that in today's story, in this scripture passage, that they find that it doesn't make sense anymore to continue being fishermen for a different reason. And that is because the Lord has invited them to follow, and they do that mysterious thing in some ways, that wondrous thing where they leave everything and they follow, and they leave it all behind. My question to you, why do you think these first stories about calling disciples are about fishermen? Why fishermen? Why are the stories about the fish? And the majority of the disciples are fishermen. What do you think that's about? Well, I think it's easy to see what Jesus was saying when he said, become fishers of men. We can easily sort of see that tie between catching fish and then a different image, catching men. That it's almost a prophecy in a way, that Jesus was sharing with these disciples this gift of what he had to offer. And it was going to be their job, after the Lord's life was over, that physical life was over, to continue teaching them, become apostles, and they would spread the word, and they're going to be part of creating this first Christian church, gathering people together. So it's, that image we can see, you're bringing together, and you're not just fishing for fish anymore, you're fishing for men. So it works that way, but I'm wondering, I think it really works on so many other levels as well. And this is the point where we get to turn to my favorite subject, one of my favorite subjects, which is the idea of correspondences. And I always kind of like to give a little example, and I know a lot of you here obviously know what this is about, but one of the most understandable examples to me is just a smile. When you smile in a sincere way because something has delighted you, made you happy, there's this physical manifestation of something that is happening in your inner life. You are physically showing and connecting with your physical self something that is happening in your inner life. And It's not just a symbol. A smile is not just a symbol of something that made you happy. It's a living connection. So let's think about fish for a minute. If fish are a physical manifestation of something happening in the inner life, what would that be? What would they represent or correspond to? Well, one thing, okay, I'll just throw this out there. One thing that helps when we're thinking about this is to know what they do and where they live and to know about them. So where do fish live?
In the water.
In the water, right. And what is water when we think about truth?
Truth.
Truth, right. So these fish are relating to some kind of truth. They live in truth. It's some kind of truth. Now, the other thing about, we can think about truth in different ways. Sometimes I like to think about it in terms of truth with a little t and then truth with a big T. So there's all sorts of little truths out there. For instance, if my tires are filled up with just the right amount of air, I know that I can get better gas mileage. That's a truth. That's really helpful. It's not a big truth, I don't think, but it's a little truth. It helps. So if you think about that, there are big truth, capital T, little truths. Do you think fish would be little t's or big t's? If you think about where they live below, right? I mean, and if you're thinking about the difference between higher or lower, or so if you think about that, little t's or big t's, what do you think? Little t's, right? Well, that's what I was reading. I think it suggests is that we need them. They're part of our ecosystem. They are good in creation. We absolutely need them. And they are more of, if you think about the fish, like what a fish you might catch, it's more about the truths about our world that we know. And some truths are really amazing. I mean, if you think about scientific discoveries and what they're learning about the creation of the world, about black holes, or about things that I can't really quite wrap my mind around, we also recognize there's all kinds of fish. There's all kinds of varieties. If you think about dolphins and how really smart they're supposed to be, or if you think about whales, where they live in water, but they actually breathe oxygen, and you have this beginning of this cross between, land animals and animals in the water. So there's all kinds of truths that we can know. But here we have suggested for us, a way of thinking about it, is all of these truths, in a way, these fish are like the smaller truths, or not necessarily smaller, but things that we know about the world and that help us. So what about fishermen? If we're going to catch these truths, then we have a desire for these things that we know about the world, and we want to put them to use. So that's like a fisherman wanting to put to use the truth that we have, in a sense. Now, what does the Lord ask them to be? Fishers of men. And it feels like, to me, like He is asking us to think about the bigger truths and to lift us up. We're asked to lift each other up, in fact. He's giving this role to the disciples to help. And if you think about just that image of raising something up out of its current environment, and raising us up, even, into thinking about spiritual truths. And how important is that? And what was Jesus doing in His lifetime? He was lifting us up out of thinking about things that are just worldly, that are just what we can know with our senses, and inviting us to think about spiritual truths that have a perspective that is eternal. So So we can choose to listen to that or not, that call. And it's interesting, if you think about other fish in the Bible, I was just all of a sudden popped into my mind Jonah and the big fish. And I was noticing, I looked it up again earlier, and it doesn't say whale, it just says big fish. And it's not a positive. I always thought that fish was really positive because it saved Jonah in a way. It kept him there for three days and 3 nights, I believe. But it wasn't a positive story. I mean, he was running away from God. And there is one way we can look at that story, which is that fish grew so big, it's like, it could be like skepticism. It could be like, we don't want to really believe anything bigger than what we know if I can't see it with my own eyes. So it's like, skepticism can be healthy, but in the sense that remaining open. And it wasn't like a place he wanted to live forever. It wasn't paradise by any means. So he comes out of that large fish. So here we have this story, lifting us up, wanting to teach higher truths. And it's interesting, if you think about our tradition, this is what happened, I think, we might say, with Emanuel Swedenborg. Here was someone teaching and loving natural truths. I mean, he was a scientist. He lived in the late 1600s into the 1700s. If you go to the Smithsonian, he's got the first exhibit of an airplane because he designed an airplane before anybody else had done so. I mean, he spoke, 9 different languages. He had his hands, an understanding of so many different fields. And he was really engaged in the scientific world. And then what happens? The Lord opens up this new life for him and calls him to this different way of seeing things. And instead of just presenting natural truths to the world, which were really good, he lifts us up and is now offering to the world what we might call spiritual truths. And wonderful truths which can help us see the scripture in a different way. It can help us understand things. It gives us an idea maybe what the afterlife is going to be like. All of these wonderful things. And there are countless people that the Lord has lifted up. And to help us see life not just as natural, but as something spiritual. There is a book I've been reading. How many of you have read Tuesdays with Morrie? Several of you. It's a really amazing book about a man who had this amazing professor. He finds out that he's dying, and he wants to go back and visit him. And they end up having every Tuesday these sessions before he passes away. And his professor was someone in his life who always tried to push him to see life outside of just earning money and thinking of life as, just where to work and just the things about it. He asks him the bigger questions and to think about those things. And after this man, Mitch, after he leaves his college days, he loses touch with the professor, and that's all he ends up pursuing is money, property, fame, as he can see it, things like that. And he gets back in touch with his professor, and even in his dying days, his professor is offering this amazing advice about what life is really about. And, talk about somebody who's trying to lift someone up out of the natural and into seeing life as a spiritual journey. I wanted to read this one passage for you. This is what he said to him. He said, "So many people walk around with a meaningless life. They seem half asleep, even when they're busy doing things that they think are important. This is because they're chasing the wrong things. The way you get meaning into your life is to devote yourself to loving others. Devote yourself to your community around you, and devote yourself to creating something that gives you purpose and meaning." this is what life is about. To remember these things, to not buy into a culture that tells us that we need more of this and more of this, or what's important is looking this way. It's bigger than that. And he does such a beautiful job in this book of lifting up some of those messages. I wanted to mention the story we have in our gospel story in Luke of the fishing. It happens again in the Gospel of John. Except this time, this story, this miraculous catch happens after Jesus has already been crucified and has risen. And the disciples are out fishing. And they're actually in the process of fishing. Here in Luke's story, it's interesting because the boats are empty. But in John's version, after Jesus has risen again, they are fishing in that moment. But they're not catching anything. And the one specific instruction that is not in Luke but is in John's Gospel is he says, let your nets down on the right side. On the right side. Our tradition tells us that right side, the meaning identified with that is that it speaks about love. Do what you're doing with love. Love has to be the motivating force. Nothing is going to come of our efforts if there's no love in it. So as we're working to lift up, with God's help, lift up our own lives, or even fishers of people, bringing other people, sharing our faith is also a part of this. But to do it with love. To do all things with love. I'm going to end there. There's so much more to this passage. And I'll just say, if anybody has time, to read that passage in Luke. And the other thing to think about, which we didn't get to, was why Simon? Why is Simon the disciple that is in this story? And if you'll notice, a name change. Look at the name change. He's just Simon. The moment he falls on his knees and confesses, I am a sinful man, get away from me, he's called Simon Peter. Something changes in that moment. There's a lot of beautiful things in our passage for today. Hopefully we can bring these things into our hearts and minds this week.